Yep. Hello, everyone. I just want to get us started. So, all good, Lisa. So, this is another excellent challenge in hybrid conferencing and technology. So, please be patient with me. Welcome. This is session 13, and we have 3 presentations today. I just want to make sure everyone's in the right room. Our first talk is from the Wongamaya Archive. Yes, everyone's got a seat. So thank you all for coming. I hope you've had a wonderful day and a half so far. I have been loving being here in person. I want to acknowledge that we're here on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people and pay my respects, and acknowledge especially the lands of the people who are coming in to talk to us today, and I think we'll hear a bit more about that. There are 3 papers, and we will go through and have the first one is a recording, and we're pretty sure it's working, so we'll just hope, and then hopefully the presenters can dial in, but they're in Port Hedland and have had some technology issues and timing issues, so we'll see how we go, and then we'll have time if they are able to dial in for some questions at the end. Then we'll move on to James, our second speaker in the room here, and then move on to Des. Hopefully we will find Des online, and he's our third speaker, and there'll be questions at the end of each of those too. I'm just going to go straight into it because we're always losing time and I want to give time. So this presentation is called What is the Wongamaya Archive? It's an archive of an Indigenous organisation, and it's a presentation by Annie, Lorraine and Bruce, and they have managed to get together and record it, and we will start playing it now, hopefully. Thank you. But while we're waiting, I do notice that I have some things to tell you. So in room 2, I don't even know what room one of this is. So in the last session, there was a handbag and jacket left over. So if you've lost your handbag and jacket in room 2, I assume it's at the ASA desk. And then just a reminder about the session on Friday, the Memory of the World session that you can still register for tonight.
Sorry, Jason, there are some changes in that, please.
Yes. If you wanted to change sessions, we'll have James go next. And yes, so a reminder about the Memory of the World, and that you can also buy copies of books from us. I'll leave you to do this then. Okay, James. I would like to introduce James to you. James and I went to uni together a long time ago and only just realised, so I'm very excited. We are graduates of UTS, so right. Thank you. I'm just going to hand straight over to James. I'm very interested in learning more about the National Trust and what you have to tell us about what's going on there. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. I always feel slightly uncomfortable saying that, and I hope I don't lose that sort of sense of discomfort, I guess. Anyway, look, I'm here to talk today about who cares. So I manage an archive which operates across 35 heritage sites scattered across New South Wales. Each heritage site has, of course, its own set of stories and their own conservation plans and issues. So the National Trust operates as a charity, and it has a 76-year history, and it's powered by a volunteer workforce. So I was interested when I started in this role 2 years ago, how we would sort of communicate with these different sites and how we'd collaborate together, and how we'd get the archives in each site working from the same page. So the Who Cares was a campaign to save Kurnell, and this was a site in Sydney. It's a little peninsula. It's been destroyed by sand mining for generations, and the archive sort of documents the history of that. So generations of protest, generations of advocacy, trying to save Kurnell, and it sort of ended with this campaign in 1970, Who Cares, Do Nothing, Watch It Die, because we felt there was no hope for it. It's interesting because we ran this campaign in 1970 at the same time as we were opening Old Government House, which was attended by Elizabeth the Queen. And in a very National Trust kind of thing, we were sort of donning the white gloves and eating cucumber sandwiches and, you know, gushing about Lord whoever and Lady whoever, and falling over ourselves, and at the same time having this sort of hard-hitting, serious campaign about saving Kurnell. So the Trust sort of traditionally runs campaigns of environmental concern and around vulnerable habitats, and that's kind of where the Trust started. So it was founded by Annie Wyatt in 1935. It was the Tree Lovers Association in Ku-ring-gai, which is on the leafy north shore of Sydney. This was found in one of her notebooks by one of my volunteers, and it's just a little thing that she wrote really for herself, which I thought was quite interesting. You can have a look at the comment, but she felt that there was so much to do in terms of preserving history, and she felt that she wasn't being listened to. So these were North Shore ladies with hats who would go out and protest sites. They were traditionally very conservative people and traditionally very well educated people. So there's this kind of thing going on where they were lobbying government to protect particular areas, and they felt that they weren't being heard. So just a bit about the origins of the archive. So the archive sort of contains meetings and minutes from those early days and ephemera from the start of the National Trust. In the origins of the Trust, we had groups of architects and heritage conservationists who were going around to different suburbs, creating maps, hand-drawn maps of an area like Haberfield, and then drawing all over them. So writing up local area conservation areas, marking out houses that were significant, marking out trees and monuments and things that they wanted to hang on to. Those maps later fed into councils. So councils, local areas and heritage were in New South Wales drawn from the base work that the National Trust had done. This is a nice one I like. This is in Annandale, and you can see on the left-hand side these three houses are called the Witches' Hats. So there's the Abbey, there's Kenilworth and there's Holroyd. They're quite unique in the suburb. They've faced a lot of challenges over the years, and it's hard to imagine, but they've been sort of close to being demolished many times, and it's only been the work of individuals who've kind of saved them. And I love this montage because a surveyor has gone out and has, photographed this and then stuck it all onto a bit of cardboard. You can see that he's drawn in the steeple at the top there and the tops of the roofs over there in the corner, which is quite a nice little touch. So we have the history of the National Trust. We also have local histories that come into the archives. And we also have the histories of each significant site. So each site has their own set of stories and has original documents and so forth. I'll come back to that in a little while. Each site also has their own conservation management plan. So conservation management plan is really how you look after a particular site and how it's managed and how we preserve it. The Trust usually pays for that, so we pay to maintain these historical places and they're often expensive to run. There's usually a complicated arrangement. So this is 31 Blythe Street in town. There's the Savoy Theatre next door that was demolished. 31 Blythe Street is leased out to the National Trust and we sublease it back to the owner in a complicated arrangement so that we can maintain the heritage on the building. We have, some of this will be very familiar to archivists in the room. We have many Access databases, we have many Excel spreadsheets, we have many different systems that have just kind of organically risen up in each particular site. We have carrots, we've got sort of sliced carrots and hummus, but we don't have any stick of any kind. And I'll come back to that in a little while. When I took over in 2020, we were very much paper-based. We are a collection institution, so I actively collect content, particularly local history content I'm really interested in. And we have an ageing volunteer workforce. We also have collections, and I work closely with the collections manager, so she looks after the knickknacks, the gewgaws and the doodads and all those other things that aren't, you know, documentary evidence, but are very significant in telling the story of each site. You may have heard about the Dutch master, so the Trust discovered we had a painting hidden away in a shed at Woodford Academy. We knew it was a Dutch still life, but we didn't know much more about it. It's about this big, it's about this big. And it was cut in half at one point, and the corner of it had been cut out so that someone could stick it up on a wall. And it was in terrible condition. Anyway, it turns out it is an original Dutch master, and it's worth about $8 million. And you can now see it at the S.H. Irvine Gallery. We're doing a tour around the country with it, but it kind of typifies the Trust a little bit, like, oh, we think we've got that back somewhere. Let's have a look, you know. And volunteers. So we have about 1,500 volunteers across the state, about 136 staff. So we really are powered by volunteers. There's about 120 volunteers who work in archives, either with me or with properties. And about half of those have a library background. So they've tried to get people with some sort of understanding of metadata. Is anyone here a librarian? Just put your hand up. It's not to... I started off my life as a librarian originally, and you know, I do work a lot with librarians, and I feel a bit like Jane Goodall because, you know, working with these primitive information people, but they are lovely, of course. And these two are discussing the Dewey system, I think. So anyway, about the Trust. So this is Retford Park in Bowral, which was, this was given to the Trust by James Fairfax. It's a beautiful property, beautiful gardens, and in lovely condition. I was talking about the carrot and stick thing and how, you know, we don't have a legislation that controls records. So we have an act that the National Trust falls under, but that act only started 30 years after the Trust, so it wasn't a foundation act like you have with some institutions. And it doesn't actually have a requirement for us to keep records. So it's very different in that regards. So James Fairfax had a lot of money. He collected a lot of art during his life. He had a lot of interesting friends. And he attracted a lot of interesting people because, you know, he had the money, he had the nice digs. And I went there, and each house is sort of run by a management committee, and this one the committee had been there since James Fairfax, you know, he'd set up this group to maintain the house, and I met, oh hello, I'm the president of the Retford Park National Trust. And, you know, he proudly told me that after James Fairfax died, they had de-accessioned some of his records because they wanted to show James in the best possible light. So that was interesting. That was a nice sort of introduction to that role. So we do have some challenges. And given the different systems and given the different issues that are going on, it's hard to get people to use the same sorts of formats. It's hard to even know where everything is. So it's really a risk management approach where I tend to go to each site, photograph it, talk to the volunteers, look at their archives and then write up a report and try to work out which items are high risk, what we need to do, you know, in the next 5 or 10 years, work out what sort of equipment they need, and then it's something I can come back to. So it's really managing it like that. As you might have gathered, the sites are gatekeepers of knowledge and their archives, and they all have their own particular quirks. So they all have their own particular ways of operating. So you have to kind of work with them. You have to get to know them, get to know what the issues are, and talk to them. We've got the usual problems that archives face. So we have pests, particularly mould around Sydney. And then further out, you get sort of rats and possums and things like that. We have the same issues with storage. So most sites, storage is a premium, and so they will send content into the trust, and then myself and my volunteers triage it, and then either try to accept it into the collection, or if it's very bad, you then just have to treat it for problems. And put it into cold storage until we can get to it. We're not a rich organisation, we are a charity, so we have to find money. We have to run appeals to get stuff done, or we have to seek funding to do it. So this is Cooma Cottage. We have these sort of before and after shots that we're quite keen on at the Trust. So this is Cooma when we took it over in 1966, and here's the front of it. In Australia, we have this thing with heritage where we need heritage to be original fabric. So we really value that. So we want to keep as much of the original as possible. This is different to, it's the same in Europe, but it's different to the Japanese model where you can actually just fabricate heritage. You can just use the same techniques and the same sort of material to create like a castle or a temple. And they do it extremely well, but in Australia, it has to be original, and if it's not original, it has to be slightly different so it stands out, so that you can tell what's been added to something. So that's Cooma. So that's Cooma now. In terms of the volunteer population, we ran a survey during COVID to find out a bit more about the volunteers across the state and work out their level of engagement. And we're also concerned with keeping them safe during COVID. So we wanted to know what was the right time to reopen for these people. And to give you a sort of understanding of the Trust a little bit, we discovered in the survey that 11.79% were between the ages of 41 and 60. We discovered 36.15% were between the ages of 61 and 70. and we discovered 39.4% were between 71 and 80, and the rest were over 80 years. And 1.79% are under 40. So you can draw your own conclusions from that. So one of the key challenges is making the collections accessible. We have a large content system called Vernon, which the aim is to move everything onto that. It has a very clunky interface, and you really need a degree in information management in order to use it. So we also have eHive, which is like a smaller version of Vernon, and it speaks to Vernon quite well, and you can import. So we're using eHive on each individual site just so they can start to get digital content out there and start to get it accessible. eHive also just lets us see what the audiences are looking at and what people are interested in. So in each individual site, like Miss Trail's house in Bathurst, can start to look at that content and see what's available. Some recent initiatives was the oral history project, which I've just started. So this is with two experts, Dr. David Jones and Dr. Bronwyn Hanna, and the three of us have been training volunteers to do oral history, so we can collect stories for each significant site. And the aim is to feed these stories back into sites. So we do a long form interview, and then we do a short video interview based on the best questions that were asked over 7 hours, with the video content being chopped up and then put into the houses. So we've done one in Somers, so it's Voices of Somers, and so you're able to then have a curated story in the background. One of the other initiatives has been the David Sheedy Foundation Scholarship. So David Sheedy worked for the Trust for about 50 years. He died in Christmas Eve 2018. He was a very humble, very shy sort of guy. He did a lot of work for the Trust, particularly heritage listings, cinemas and railways. This very low quality JPEG is the only image we have of David Sheedy. He didn't like any kind of recognition. We gave him 2 medals. He didn't turn up to the awards. So he'd probably be slightly horrified to have a scholarship named after him, but oh well. Another thing I've been doing is putting together exhibitions. So part of our advocacy is to create exhibitions that help to engender awareness about heritage issues. So we had one on Sydney Cove, which was really looking at the redevelopment of Sydney Cove and the first skyscrapers, so the AMP building. We got some archives from the AMP when they closed their archive down. Their archivist of 40 years left before COVID, and they gave content to us, and they gave us a bit of funding to put an exhibition on. They were probably grateful for some good publicity at this point. And we've also done demolished heritage to raise awareness about what we've lost in Sydney, and Parramatta heritage, which is really looking at Parramatta Park. Working with curators, I've learnt some very useful techniques in terms of bringing the archives out there. So I've standardised the template that we use for exhibitions, so that we can start to make the cards and the signage interchangeable a little bit. Means that we can move exhibitions around. Working with curators at the Trust has helped improve the way that I think about exhibitions and how we put them on. So less signage, less text, and sort of more targeted types of content based on what our people are looking for. I'll just wrap up quickly. So we'll come back to Who Cares, and this is the campaign for Kernel. So the campaign, I feel you could draw some connections to the archives profession itself. Archives has a lot of goodwill, but it has an ageing workforce and it has limited growth. We're all aware that there are now only 2 courses that are running archives in Australia, but it's still on the list for essential jobs, jobs that you can come with an overseas qualification for. So there is a need for it, but what are we actually doing to preserve the profession? I think we are the original content creators, and we can actually engage audiences, and we need to be doing that more actively. We need to be working closely with curators and with groups like marketing in order to identify our collections and to focus on what our audiences want. Like Kernel, we simply can't be. We have to challenge and excite and prove our value for our audience. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you, James. That was very entertaining as well as being very insightful, and I learned a lot about the National Trust too, so that was good. Can I open up to the floor for questions? Yes, Angela.
My name's Angela Schilling. I'm from the Lutheran Archives in Adelaide. Thanks for your talk. I was just wondering, we're in the same position as well with lots of ageing volunteers, and that also hold a lot of knowledge about the archives and about the collection. So just wondering if you have any idea as to how to deal with that and the sustainability of the National Trust and
Well, it's interesting. I didn't include this cartoon from the 60s of the National Trust, but it was basically making fun of the age of the National Trust members. It's like Antique Roadshow, and it's all the members who are antiques walking in. I'm not really sure. The Oral History Project was in some ways to address the knowledge that we were losing from the organisation, so particularly architects, heritage conservationists, people who've had a lot of foundation work in the heritage space in New South Wales, but also the stories of the sites are really important as well. And that's really something that needs to be an ongoing practice. So you don't just have an oral history project and it's like, that's finished. It needs to be embedded in the organisation. You need to be collecting that as you go. In terms of how do you engage young people in heritage? I mean, how do you engage people in archives? It's probably a very similar sort of issue. It's probably a certain type of personality who's drawn to this sort of thing anyway. So we have to find out what our audiences want. And I think we have to target the archives accordingly.
Thank you.
Thanks.
More questions? Yes, one at the back here. Thank you.
Hello, Louise Howard, Queensland State Archives. I'm interested in your thoughts on what we're seeing in South Australia now, where they're looking at removing a key property from the Heritage Register to build the new hospital there, and what that says about the challenge of the value of what we've said was once significant with what we're now saying, hang on, no, it's not significant enough, whether you're seeing that push towards any of the National Trust properties, and also whether there's any ability for what you have within the archives to support I guess the movements to perhaps preserve some of those significant places.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's an ongoing kind of challenge. You know, we saw this in Sydney with the female factory at the old mental hospital site in Parramatta. So the female factory has rare UNESCO World Heritage listing. And the psychiatric hospital that surrounds it, I think, has a great significance as well. the state government sort of dragged their feet on that for a very long time, and then finally gave parts of the psychiatric institution heritage listing, and then destroyed Willow Grove. So they dismantled Willow Grove brick by brick, and they said, "Oh, we'll rebuild it later." You know. But there's always this give and take. So it's like, you know, the Central Railway Station. They're keeping the shape of Central Railway, but they're putting this huge monstrosity on top of it, and that's kind of the give and take of it. The trust is very much about adaptive reuse, so we're about keep the structure of the building and keep as much of the function of the building, and reinterpret it, and, you know, make it so that it's usable in the modern world. Because a lot of these older buildings also weren't designed for the Australian environment, so they need to be readapted anyway. But yes, it's a good question. It's probably one that you need to speak to the advocacy team in South Australia about.
Thank you. One last question. Anyone? Or any questions from online? Yeah?
Okay, Fiona Byrne has just said that Woodford Academy has recently held some imaginative events linking with community groups to bring new audiences to the venue, example steampunk. And Lee Davey has written that Queanbeyan Museum is in Heritage Police Sergeant's Cottage built in 1875. We are having a similar struggles looking at adopting eHive for the collection.
Thank you. Can I say thank you to James? And I think hearing these comments and the questions are that it's important that we keep sharing these stories and sharing our struggles and what's going on so that we know we're not alone. So thank you very much. So now you're early for lunch, but maybe that's okay. Maybe don't annoy them too much out there. Oh no, actually Lisa's got something to say.
Is that working? Yep. There was a question for James.
Oh.
Let me find it. It's from Glenn Wells. Concerning attracting young people. So I should put that in context. Has disability employment support been considered? I'm thinking about young people with disabilities who are able to get NDIS funding for a support person but still have some struggles finding a willing employer.
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's probably something that I'd need to take on notice. I'd like to engage with that properly, but probably I'll send her. My email details are all on the system anyway. Please contact me and I'll see what we're doing in that space, but I'd like to address that properly. Thanks.
Thanks, James.
Thank you. And can I say thank you to our volunteer Ruth and Lisa from the program committee as well. And we have a little gift for James, so thank you. And I think that our other presenters are getting them in the mail. So thank you everyone for your patience and for coming along today.